Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Tonight we have 10 messed up stories from around the internet, ranging from Google Maps, the ocean, stalkers, amusement parks, and more. I'd like to give a huge thank you to all of the authors of these stories for allowing me to share them with all of you. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. Liking the video if you enjoy is always appreciated. I know it's a tall order, but let's aim for 2,000. Every like helps immensely. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. We tell scary stories here all the time. Also, the intro you saw at the beginning was made by my good friend Jensen. He's been blowing up on multiple platforms lately, including YouTube. He does a bunch of stuff on his channel, from art stuff, parodies, and scary story narrations. He didn't ask me to mention his channel or anything, but I think you guys would enjoy his stuff, so I'll be leaving a link to his channel in the description if you want to check him out. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the stories. Enjoy the video, and if you eat ass, brush your teeth. Some people ask me why I never use the Street View function on Google Maps. They say things like, "How will you know what the place looks like?" Or, "Don't you want to see more than just bird's eye view of the place?" I usually reply by saying it's always better to go outside and see things with your own eyes, which usually ends in them commending me for my confidence. Truth be told, the reason I say that is not because of confidence. On the contrary, it's because of fear. To understand where I am coming from, I need to tell you the story of how I first found out about Google Maps. I was in elementary school at the time, and during computer class, instead of doing the assigned project, my friend and I were fooling around on coolmathgames.com. We were playing Fireboy and Water Girl when one of my friends started to speak. "Hey, you guys heard of Google Maps?" "Yeah, my parents use it all the time." "But did you know that you can actually see the places on the map? Like, you're actually there?" To my 12-year-old brain, that sounded amazing. I let my friend pull up Google Maps on my computer, then he asked me for a place I wanted to see. How about our school?" "School? Really?" "Yeah, I want to see how it looks." After typing in the address of our school, my friend dragged this little yellow stick man into the school address and opened up Street View. I was mesmerized by the pictures on the screen. It felt so surreal to be able to navigate and look around as if you were really there. I could see everything. From the broken swings at the playground to the concrete stairs that lead to the front door. Something about being able to see things without actually being there appealed to my young mind. "Oh, did you know that you can see your house too? Here, let me show you my house." My friend typed in his address and pulled up the street view of his house. I visited his place many times before, and the house looked just as in real life. The yellow exterior, the white fences at the front, and the garden at the side. Google Maps gave a perfect recreation of my friend's abode. While we were sitting there snickering at my friend's house, the bell rang, and it was time to go home. After school, I did my usual routine of going home, searching the pantry for anything to eat, then going up to my room and playing on my computer. I didn't have any homework that night, and my parents said they were going to be home late, so I had the house all to myself. As a kid, I decided the best thing to do was play flash games as late into the evening as I could. Eventually, I got bored of playing flash games and wondered what I should do. It was just past 6 p.m., but it was dark outside already. I looked out of my bedroom window and saw all the houses in my neighborhood with lights shining through their windows. Suddenly, I remembered about the Google Maps thing my friend showed me at school that day. I eagerly opened up Google Maps and typed in my address. Then, I opened up Street View. The image of my home covered my screen. I had a fun time dragging the camera around and seeing everything. I even zoomed into the living room window, imagining that maybe I would see someone if I zoomed in enough. Of course, the window was too blurry after I zoomed in that much. I decided to zoom out again and take a look at my house as a whole. It was then that I noticed something odd. There was a man wearing a hoodie near my side gate. I tried zooming onto the man's face, but I could only see the back of his head. For context, the side of my childhood house has a gate that leads into the backyard. Right above that gate was my bedroom window. Being an imaginative child, and given it was dark outside, I rushed to my window and pulled back the curtains, expecting to see someone scary. When I looked down, I sighed in relief. Of course, there was no one by the side gate. When I got back on my computer, I was greeted by a horrifying sight. The image of a man's crooked face with eyes bulging and a cartoonishly wide smile. I never zoomed out from the man's face before checking the window, so his face filled my whole screen. I instantly zoomed out. I wanted to close my browser, but I was afraid that if I did, the man would go away. Since I zoomed out, I got to see the man's full body. The best way to describe the man was tall, lanky, and crooked. He had a hoodie on, and his hands were in his hoodie pockets. His head was tilted to one side, and his eyes were staring directly at the screen. What really scared me was how his entire torso was facing the screen, as if he knew I was looking at him. The street view images were all taken during the day, so I reasoned to myself that even if there was a smiling man outside, that could not possibly be happening at this moment. After all, it was already dark out. I looked at the date the images were taken and saw it was taken months ago. I then looked again outside my window just to confirm no one was at the side gate. Thus, I was reassured there was no way the man was currently outside my house. When I looked back at the computer, my eyes widened. The man stood just as he did moments ago, except one of his hands were outside of his pockets. The hand was giving me a thumbs down. All this time, the man was still staring directly at the screen with his bulging eyes and absurdly wide smile. I darted downstairs and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I closed all the curtains for all the windows, then locked myself in my room. When I looked back at my computer, I saw the man's face was no longer smiling. Now, it was laughing. I considered closing the browser, but I was deathly afraid of what would happen if I did so. Clearly, it seemed the man was responding to what I was doing, so I was left staring at his image on my screen. After a few minutes of staring at the man and making sure I don't take my eyes off him, my computer got the blue screen of death. Panicking, I quickly unplugged my computer and plugged it back in, trying to restart it. The screen came alive and showed the Windows XP boot up screen. There was nothing but silence throughout the entire house. I sat there, looking at the boot up screen, wanting nothing more than to get back on Google Maps to make sure the man was still there. Back then, PCs took a very long time to load. Suddenly I heard the doorknob to my front door start jiggling. I feared the worst. Was that the man? I looked back at my computer and it was still booting up. The jiggling stopped. Then I heard the familiar creaking sound of my front door opening. My heart was racing in my chest and my hands were trembling. I knew the door to my room was locked, but if the man could get through the front door, he could just as easily get through the door to my room. Then I heard my mom's voice calling out, "We're home." All the tension I had suddenly disappeared and I raced downstairs to see my parents taking off their shoes at the front door. I frantically told them about what happened regarding the man, and they did not believe me. I practically dragged them to my room and opened up Google Maps Street View for our house, expecting to see the familiar jagged smile. However, the man was not there. I zoomed in and out all over my house and could find no trace of the man. I kept insisting that he was there, but my parents never believed me. They said that even if the man was there was no way it could have happened in real time since the photos were taken months ago. The next day, I told my friends the story at lunchtime and, well, it scared them for a moment. They eventually forgot about the story. I never forgot about what happened that night. The memory of the man's crooked smile and bulging eyes come back to me whenever I consider opening up Street View on Google Maps. So now, whenever someone asks me why I never use Street View, I simply tell them that I would rather see things with my own eyes than trust whatever image is on the screen. My father, for as long as I could remember, was afraid of the ocean. He wanted nothing to do with the beach. Even at the mere mention of visiting the beach, he would get agitated and angry. It's not like he was afraid of water, because he had no problem with going to a lake, river, or pool. In fact, he had a large freshwater pond at our house, but it was the ocean that scared him. We lived in a small town in central Pennsylvania, far from the nearest beach. Last year, my father passed away. It was peaceful and painless. After his death, I decided to research his side of the family. He was an immigrant from Scotland. I know he had parents and a brother, but he never talked about them. My grandparents passed away years ago, but my uncle was still around. I did some digging and found my uncle's phone number. He was still living in Scotland, more specifically the Orkneys. I had never been to the Orkneys or Europe. I got in contact with my uncle in Scotland. He was thrilled to talk to me. He told me that he hasn't heard from my father in 6 years and asked how he was doing. I told him the grave news, and he was very sad to hear this because he didn't know my father wasn't doing well. They told me they would have come over to the US to visit. I told him I was going to visit the Orkneys to see where my father grew up and to do some sightseeing. My uncle eagerly agreed. We made the arrangements, and in 2 weeks I flew to Scotland. I landed at Inverness Airport in northern Scotland, and I took the ferry to the Orkneys. My uncle was waiting to pick me up. We drove to his house where my aunt and cousins were waiting for me. We had a few glasses of whiskey and reminisced about my father. I had fun talking to them and wondered why my dad rarely mentioned his side of the family, as nothing about them seemed off. Late into the evening, my uncle brought out an old photo album and we went over the pictures. They dated back to at least the 70s. My dad looked so young and happy in all of them. I could see the resemblance between me and him. All the photos seemed normal. There were family photos, birthday and Christmas photos, and pictures with him and his friends. One photo in particular did catch my eye. It was of my father in his teens, on a sailboat out at sea. This made no sense to me because I knew for a fact that my father was scared of the ocean. I pointed this out to my uncle, asking him how they got him onto a boat in the middle of the ocean. My uncle seemed puzzled and asked what I meant. I explained to him my father's fear of the ocean and how he wanted nothing to do with it. My uncle laughed and said that my father loved going out on the ocean and was an avid fisher and sailor. I thought back to my childhood and asked my father if we could go to the beach. He instantly tensed up and gave me a look that conveyed worry and terror. He told me that it was too far and that it's not a good idea. I also remember asking my mom about this fear, and she told me that it was the only thing she couldn't figure out about him. She told me that when they were dating, they drove to a small town after a lot of convincing. During the day, my father seemed unbothered when he was on the boardwalk. At night, my mother managed to convince him to take a moonlight walk on the beach. Everything seemed fine for a while, and then suddenly my father stared out into the horizon and then took off running inland. My mother gave pursuit and found him at the car in tears, rocking back and forth, repeating, "It followed me," over and over again. They decided to drive back to the hotel they were staying at. My mom tried to pry my father about what he saw, but he shook his head and refused to say anything, only responding, "If I talk about it, it'll find me again." When they got back to the hotel, my mom told me that my father was on edge the whole night, getting no sleep and constantly looking out the window. The next day they cut the vacation short and went home. To this day, my mother always respected his wishes to never go to the beach. I continued to flip through the photo album and saw another picture of my father on a fishing pier shirtless. This picture struck me as odd because I couldn't see the scars he had on his left shoulder. Another thing to note, my father had 3 distinct scars on his shoulder. He had them for as long as I could remember. When I asked him about it, he told me he fell off his bike when he was a kid. But according to this picture, it was evident that he was lying. I asked my uncle about this, and he said he didn't get those scars until he was in his early 20s, and that some animal attacked him. I explained to my uncle about my father's fear of the ocean and how he lied to me about his scars and how I found all of this so bizarre. I brought this up to my uncle, explaining my father's fear of the ocean, and asking why he would lie about the scars. My uncle thought for a moment. He then got very somber and told me that the night he got those scars, he left for the mainland to stay with extended family, later immigrating to America seemingly out of nowhere. What happened the night he got those scars? I asked. My uncle got very serious and finished off his whiskey and poured another glass. It's not a night I like to remember. He took a deep breath. Your father liked to take walks on the beach at night. He did this for years with no problems at all. He would just clear his head and forget the world. One night he went out. It was bitter cold in the middle of winter. Our grandfather insisted that he skip his walk that night. Your father just ignored him, but bundled up and promised to be back shortly. He was gone for 3 hours. Your grandfather was about to go look for him, but then seemingly out of nowhere, your father burst into the house screaming bloody murder. His clothes were torn to shreds, and he had those 3 gashes on his shoulder. Your father was in hysterics. We couldn't get him to calm down and had no idea what happened. He eventually passed out on the spot. We had a doctor come over, and he told us that he must have been attacked by a stray dog, and he was just shaken up. The next day, your father left for the mainland, only saying that he couldn't stay here anymore. We let him go thinking that he needed some time away from home, and that he would calm down eventually. But we never saw him again. My uncle wiped away a tear. To this day, I don't know what happened to him that night. It can't have been a dog that attacked him. The scratches on his shoulder were from claws or something, and the damage to his coat had to have been from something that had immense strength. I had more questions, but my uncle was visibly upset, so I changed the subject. We spent the rest of the evening just small talking until the alcohol made us drowsy enough to go to bed. That week, my uncle showed me around the islands and took me to the best bars in the UK. We had some great drunken nights together, and I got some great scenic pictures of the islands. I had such a great time that I promised myself that I would make this trip a yearly venture. That was not to be, though. My last night on the Orkneys is when it all became clear. My uncle and I had just gotten back from a bar where we toasted each other and my father's memory. When we got back to my uncle's house, he was pretty drunk and went to bed. I was drunk, but very much awake. I decided to go for a walk around town. I walked up the streets towards the shoreline. Even though it was winter, it had rained earlier, giving the air more of a crisp, and found a pathway into the woods. I took the trail following my ears to the sounds of the waves. When I got to the beach, I was greeted by cold, salty air and the light of a full moon on the water. I walked down the beach and saw an old abandoned fishing shack. It was pretty old, the sea breeze chipping away at it for years. A few rusty buckets filled with rainwater were on the outside. I looked at my watch and told myself I would take a brief walk and come back to the fishing shack. I let the environment of the beach absorb me. This was such a unique experience for me since, as a kid, I never had the pleasure of being close to the ocean. I sniffed the air and let the sound of the waves immerse me. I looked out into the ocean, observing the moonlight on the water. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the atmosphere changed. It went from calm and soothing to bitter cold and malice-filled. I looked at the water and saw something emerge from it. What I saw cannot be explained in the realm of reason. At first glance, I thought it was a man riding a horse, but after closer examination, I could tell it wasn't human. The thing was a horse-like creature that had the upper body of a man fused to its back. Its face was skeletal, covered in muscle tissue, only missing a nose replaced with a gaping hole. The whole thing was skinless. I could clearly see its muscles pulsing. It had small protrusions of bone all over its body. Its arms dangled at its sides, each hand with 3 very long claws. The skeletal face of the man looked human, and was followed by the horse half. The creature then pointed at me with its dangly arms and gave an inhuman shriek. This snapped me out of my stupor, and I began to run in the direction of the fishing shack. I thought I had a head start, but then I heard the sound of a horse panting as well as the clump hooves behind me. It was gaining on me. I didn't know if I could outrun it. I then felt my hood being grabbed, and I was lifted into the air. The thing had held me up and shook me. It brought me closer to the horse face of its body. Its breath smelled like death and decay. Out of impulse, I poked the eye of the horse and it dropped me. The horse half recoiled and bucked while the human part of the creature shrieked. I got up and began running again. I knew if it caught me, it would definitely not be kind to me this time. I found the old shack, but the creature was in hot pursuit behind me. I hid in the shack and closed the door, hoping I could wait it out until morning. The creature circled the shack. Each thump of its hooves sent my adrenaline skyrocketing. It began to taunt me verbally, speaking perfect English. Its voice was raspy and ancient. "You were wise to come back, Alexander." My blood froze. Alexander was my father's name. The creature thought I was my father. The creature kept talking as I stayed still. "I do not let slights against me go unpunished, and I don't like it when my hunt gets away from me." My father must have beaten this thing back at some point, but how? I tried to think, but then was interrupted when the creature burst its way into the shack. The horse half drooled with anticipation while the human half smiled. I backed away, thinking about what this thing was going to do to me. Then a drop of rainwater landed on its shoulder, and it flinched as if it was hot. I then thought that this thing must be averse to fresh water. Seizing the opportunity, I grabbed one of the rusted buckets of rainwater and doused the creature in it. It shrieked in pain as the horse half bucked and kicked. I picked up another bucket and doused the human half in the face. It shrieked and cursed me. I picked up the last bucket and downed the creature in the horse's face. It roared in pain and anger. I used this distraction and ran around it and exited what was left of the shack. I ran to the woodland pathway and up the trail back to town with shrieks of the creature fading behind me. I ran back to my uncle's house. Once inside, I locked the door and broke down. I had no clue what just happened. I didn't sleep. All I did was think about the creature. That must have been the animal my father encountered all those years ago. The next morning, I told my uncle everything about the creature and my theory of how it was the same one that attacked my father. My uncle became pale and nodded, saying that it all made sense now. He explained to me that I have encountered the Engoby, an ancient ocean demon that has terrorized the inhabitants of the Orkneys since the Vikings first landed. He told me in the dead of winter it is known to emerge from the water to attack and kill humans. He then told me that it is adverse to fresh water, and that I was right to douse it with the rainwater. He told me that if its prey gets away, it feels spurned and will always watch the escaped prey from a distance. He never thought the Engoby was real, thinking it was just an old folks' tale. He told me that I needed to leave the Orkneys and never come back for my own safety. I didn't argue. He drove me to the ferry and dropped me off. As I waved goodbye, I looked up the shore and could have sworn I saw the Engoby watching me, with pure malice in its stare. Today I live in Arizona, far away from any body of water and still keep in contact with my uncle. My only advice is this: if you visit the beach in the dead of winter, please be careful. You never know when you could become hunted. Space. An endless scape void of anything except for the occasional mixture of hydrogen and helium held together by gravity. Every so often, you get a clump of rocks that get caught in the gravity, and they start to move in circles around it because that's just how it works. Every so often out of that, one of those clumps of rocks pointlessly rotating around a mixture of gases get caught in just the right place where water can liquefy. And because of laws and science or whatever other bullshit, life occurs. I rolled my eyes, preparing for another one of my friend Austin's passionate rants about how arbitrary the concept of life is. "Yeah," I replied. "Thanks for explaining to me how we're all here. Can I go now? I've got class early tomorrow." No, just listen to me, man. What is stopping the idea that life can exist in other forms? Beings adapted to live in any conditions. I mean, we've seen it with the tardigrade. It can survive the vacuum of space. Who is saying a being similar to that nature, and maybe even intelligent, aren't out there somewhere? Laws that humans, who don't know everything, have deemed fact. Answer me that. You sound ridiculous, dude. I said, slinging my backpack over my shoulder and exiting the lab. You know I'm right, Austin called out behind me as I walked away. Sorry. I should probably introduce myself. My name's Carter. I am a 22-year-old college senior, and for the last 4 years, I've been studying astronomy. Something about space, the unknown, so much to explore and learn. It's always intrigued me. I mean, think about it. We are a tiny blue island in the middle of a massive void, and we don't even know how big it is. Of course, all of this was how I felt before I found out what I know, but we'll get to that in due time. I met Austin during freshman year. When I was looking for roommates, I put that I would prefer someone who is also an astronomy major, and he ended up being my roommate. We became best friends very quickly. Countless late nights talking about the universe and what may be in it. With a mutual passion, we both loved staying out late and looking at planets and stars through our telescope. We also loved staying late to the lab and doing research. Call us nerds, but we loved it. Over the past few months, though, Austin had begun to get obsessed. He started talking about a new energy wave he had discovered. Apparently, if done right, it could be used for travel across the universe in seconds. Opening up wormholes is how he described it. He was convinced that other forms of life had surely discovered this method previously, and he could tap into it. We could hopefully contact these life forms. It began to get odd. He would spend late nights at the lab, barely sleeping. He had bags under his eyes, messy hair, empty Red Bull cans always within an arm's reach of him. I just need to be able to find where it's coming from, he would always say. How do you even know this energy wave even exists? How did you find it? I asked him one day. It's too hard to explain to you now, but you have to believe me. Trust me, it's there. I will prove to you that there is life out there in the universe, and it's causing it. I will find it, he replied. I rolled my eyes and left him to his pointless tinkering. I was beginning to lose my friend. He had gone mad. It was sad, but at the same time, I couldn't let it put a stop to my life. I had to quit worrying about him, and just hope that one day he'd come to his senses and give it up. Last week, however, at 2 a.m., I received a call. It was from Austin. I answered it, wiping the tiredness from my eyes. Hello? I asked into the phone. Get over here now, dude. I did it. I found a way to detect it. If I can prove it to you. Get over here now. He yelled ecstatically. What? Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I replied, throwing my clothes on and rushing to my car. On the drive over there, I wasn't even sure what to think. Had he really done what he'd been trying to do? Had all of this madness not been madness after all? I was still very skeptical, but the thoughts itched in the back of my mind. I pulled into the parking lot of the lab and called Austin. I'm here. Where are you? I asked. Okay, great. I'm coming to let you in. A few seconds later, I saw Austin shove the door open and wave at me to come inside. I got out of my car and started walking up to him. Hurry up, man. You need to see this. I did it. He yelled. Shh, keep your voice down. I said, I don't want campus police pulling up on us. I'm pretty sure we're not even supposed to be here. We got inside, and once the door closed, I finally asked, Now what exactly did you do? He was vibrating with excitement. You know that energy wave I've been trying to find? Trace to its source? Discover life? Well, I found a way to do it. I found a way to trace it back. I was puzzled. What? How? I replied. I'll show you. Follow me. We rushed downstairs to the lab, and when I walked through the door, the biggest contraption I had ever seen was filling the entire room. It was a massive glass tube circling the perimeter of the room, and in the center was a laptop hooked up to a massive computer. What the hell is this? I asked. This, my friend, is what I've been keeping secret for so long. I've made my very own particle accelerator. I've been keeping it a secret because I know if you or any of my professors found out, they would force me to stop, but I've done it. How it works is I have a bending magnet on one end, and at the other end is a focusing magnet. When the electricity is flipped on, the atoms begin to hurl towards each other and collide with each other. Not bad physics for an astronomy major, huh? I was astonished. How had he done all of this? Where had he assembled it? How did he get in the lab? This was ridiculous, and none of it made sense. And he was right. He was an astronomy major. Where did he learn all the highly advanced physics needed to even think of something like this? It was quite easy, really. I did some research and I learned all you needed is an electric field and magnets to focus those fields. Was all I could get out. I had so many questions, but I was too dumbfounded to ask them. The only one I got out was, why? He smirked. This is where a little luck comes into play. You know the theory of the Higgs boson, right? Well, this new energy wave is in the Higgs field. What we do is we throw the particles at each other. When they collide, we only have a small window to completely shut off the contraption. What this will do is interrupt the collision, and if the Higgs boson is formed, it will transcend it into a lower energy state. When one Higgs boson does this, it causes a reaction where other Higgs bosons possibly create. This is that energy I've been trying to prove. The Higgs boson is what gives mass to everything, right? So when transcended into a lower energy state, it takes away the mass. What I've been trying to prove has literally been anti-mass in a sense. My head was swirling with 1,000,000 thoughts a second. Anti-mass, Higgs bosons. What? How the hell had he figured all of this out? He continued. I know I've proved it because I've done it once. I tested it myself and it worked. Only for a split second though. I couldn't see shit, but I'm telling you, something's out there causing this. I just know it, and I'm gonna find out what it is. We aren't the only ones in the universe, and surely some other life form has discovered this. I know it. And if I can do it right, I'll be able to contact them. Are you with me? He asked. I don't know what to say, man. This is all insane. What exactly do you plan to do even if you are right? I just need to know I'm not insane. Now again, are you with me? He asked. I shook my head. I guess. What exactly do we have to do? He immediately went to the laptop. He started typing in a few things and then looked at me. When I pressed this button, the particle accelerator is going to turn on and we're going to count to 10. Right at 10 seconds, I want you to go to the wall over there and unplug the 2 power cords you see in there, okay? Tell me right before you do it, and I will halt the acceleration at the same time. This should cause the reaction I'm looking for. What happens after that? I guess we'll have to find out. Are you ready? No, I said. Austin laughed. Neither am I, he said. But let's do this. I walked over to the power cord and waited for him to start it up. He pressed the button. The accelerator started up. A small humming noise could be heard throughout the room. It actually worked. I was amazed. He wasn't kidding. Right at that moment he started counting down from 10, I began to get ready. 3, 2, 1. He pulled the cords out as hard as I could. And right as I did, I saw Austin slam the keyboard of the laptop. In a split second, the power shut off and the glass tube circling the room shattered. A portal ripped open and began shaking the room violently. It was swirling around the edges and paper was flying everywhere. I tried my best to see what was on the other side, but shattered glass and paper were flying all over the room and I had to cover my face. I could see stars. Space, I thought, through muffled vision and loud, chaotic noise. I heard Austin scream. Austin, are you okay? I yelled, but I got no reply. I then began to see a massive hand the size of the room itself extend out from the portal. It was no human hand, far too gargantuan and jet black. Each finger was the size of me. I saw it slowly come through the portal and wrap itself around Austin. Austin was crying out in fear. I watched as it slowly pulled him back into the portal and closed it behind him. The last thing I heard was Austin screaming, but his screams being drowned out by the void of space screaming back. The portal swirled violently until it abruptly disappeared. I was left there alone. The room in shambles and the power out. I was hyperventilating. I frantically looked around the room, hoping to see Austin, praying that the entire thing was a hallucination. I then began to hear sirens outside. That was last week. I was questioned by the police and I could barely even tell them what happened. They walked in and saw the room in shambles and me sitting there, a panicked mess. I was of course arrested and am now facing obstruction of property charges and mentally ill since the story I told them was obviously very unbelievable. I was expelled and now have to pay back the damage done to the lab. I'm typing this out now because no one believes me and I'm hoping you all on here will. I've tried to explain it to my parents, but they just shake their heads in disappointment. The only thing no one can seem to explain, though, is the disappearance of Austin. The police started an investigation, and of course, I'm their primary suspect. Austin died trying to prove what he believed in. I thought he was crazy, but in reality, he was right. I know what happened to him. He was taken by whatever that thing on the other side of the portal was. I never saw its face, but I know Austin did. The brief moments I was able to catch a glance of him, he was wearing the most horrified face I'd ever seen on a person. I'm not sure how I will mentally recover from all this. All I can say is after my encounter, I now know there are things in the universe that are simply meant to be left alone. If humanity goes knocking on doors it shouldn't be, how long until something knocks back? I've seen what exists in our universe. It took my friend. There are things we don't understand and weren't meant to understand. Maybe it should stay that way. So I grew up in a relatively small town. Most people knew each other, and rumors always spread quickly. But a story had been lingering far longer than any of us had known, about a creature tormented by the outside world and brutalized. Our parents always told us what to do when it was time for the ritual. It was said that the creature only came for one night, and it was always a new moon when it was darkest. We had been told to gather up a drop of blood, wipe it on a sheet of paper with a cross and pentagram, then lay it on our front porch and silently wait after we locked all the doors and windows. It was supposedly blind, so covering our windows didn't concern us. But soon, I started losing belief, thinking it was all just a silly joke taken too far. So I decided to prove it was fake and show everyone how foolish it was. But I was the only foolish one. On the first night upon the new moon, I told my parents I had to use the bathroom. But I had other plans. Our bathroom had a one-way emergency exit of sorts, so I used it to sneak out without my parents noticing. I then took off for the sidewalk. Soon after reaching the sidewalk, I began slowly and calmly walking down the street, noticing how nice it was that night. I took time to think, breathe, but not time to pay attention to my surroundings. I was about 20 feet away from our house when I stopped walking. There was a sound coming from down the sidewalk, a slow, raspy groan of sorts. I was curious but also freaked out. I considered going back but thought it would be cowardly. It was surprisingly dark even for a night with a new moon. The groaning had grown louder and even more strange as I thought, like it was getting closer. I then spotted something about 70 feet down the sidewalk in the center of the walk path. I thought it was a person at first but realized just about everyone except for me would be locked up in their homes by now, and it was too odd looking to be human. I noticed it didn't move an inch. I turned for a moment, wanting to go back, but after a moment of hesitation, turned back around towards the thing. It had somehow gotten a lot closer. Then I saw what it looked like. Tall, skinny, and pale with dozens, if not hundreds of blind eyes covering its head from front to back. No nose, no mouth, nothing. It had arms that reached down to its heels, and it was no more than 3 inches shorter than a street light. Its fingers were nothing but implanted needles. Then it began slowly walking towards me and slowly felt around with its 2 arms. But it stopped. Its head shot to my face, and I stood there frozen in pure dread and terror. It was still about 16 feet, but it somehow knew I was there, even though it hadn't been able to see me or feel me. I heard a snap, and then a pain groan as something ripped, and I saw that 2 additional arms had grown, ripping through its skin, allowing it to start quickly crawling in my direction. This was it. I was going to die in the middle of a sidewalk to this hideous thing. I then felt a firm and strong grip on my wrist, and began being dragged quickly back in the direction of our house. Then I heard a voice shout out to the creature, and it backed off for a moment, then sprinted off after a stick was thrown at it, and hit one of its eyes. I had been dragged back by my mother. I had never been so terrified yet so relieved in my life. Despite the scolding, and soon the disappearance of our neighbors, we soon moved away, thankfully never hearing of that thing ever again. There's a big age gap between me and my sister, 10 years to be exact. I've always looked up to her, since she always seemed to have her life totally under control, never stressed, social, punctual, the total opposite of me. The type of person that totally neglects all their schoolwork and plays Stardew Valley all afternoon instead. When I was 10, my sister, Tanya, got married at 20. She and her husband didn't waste much time, and I had been 11 for 3 months when my niece, Sadie, was born. I became an uncle in 6th grade. I'm 17 now, and Sadie is 6, almost 7. Tanya and her husband, Alex, live across town, and usually their neighbor babysits for them when they go out. But yesterday afternoon, I got a call from Tanya, asking me if I could come watch Sadie that evening. We've got reservations at a really nice restaurant, but my neighbor's busy. I need someone to watch Sadie, she'd said. You've got your driver's license now. Can you please come by for the evening? I guess, I answered. I don't really have anything else to do. Oh, thank you so much, Jake, she said. Come at 6, okay? Okay, see you then. It was already dark when I arrived. Tanya and Alex greeted me at the door. Tanya gave me a crash course on the basics of childcare. We already ate dinner, so you don't need to worry about that. Bedtime's at 8, but she might want to go to sleep earlier. If that's the case, just watch TV in the living room or something. If she gives you any trouble, just threaten to call me and tell me how naughty she's been. You can have anything in the fridge, except the cheesecake. Damn, I love cheesecake, I said. And don't swear around her, Tanya's son. She's impressionable. Sadie took that moment to walk up to me and said, Hi, Uncle Jake. Hey, Sadie, you're so tall now, I said in that childish voice everyone uses when talking to kids. Noticing she was holding something behind her back, I asked, What have you got there? This is Izzy, Sadie said, holding out the doll in front of her. Izzy was a plastic doll with glass eyes, stuffed into a dress that looked like it was pulled from the pages of Little House on the Prairie. The doll looked a little worse for wear, like it had been owned by several other kids before Sadie. I forced myself to smile. But I've never liked dolls much. I always found them really unnerving, and Izzy was no exception. In fact, with her gleaming blue glass eyes, she seemed especially creepy. Well, good luck, Tanya patted my shoulder. We'll be back in about 4 hours. Bye, Mommy. Bye, Daddy. Sadie waved as they walked out the door. Then she turned to me and asked, So what are we gonna do? I don't know, I said. What do you want to do? Sadie thought for a moment and then said, Video games. Apparently, the only thing she remembered about me was that I played lots of video games. Fortunately, I'd come prepared, and introduced her to the joy that is Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time on the 3DS. She got the hang of it remarkably fast, especially for a 6-year-old, and she played for almost a solid hour while I listened to some music, throwing out advice whenever she asked for help. Izzy the doll sat next to her the whole time. At around 7, Sadie announced that she was tired and wanted to go to bed. Bedtime was still an hour away, but I wasn't going to complain. She got her pajamas on and brushed her teeth, and I tucked her in and read her a bedtime story. I asked her if she wanted me to stay for a while, but she said she slept better by herself and told me she'd call for help if she needed something. Izzy was lying next to her, staring blankly at the ceiling, and I went back down the stairs. I checked the fridge and didn't see anything particularly good apart from the forbidden cheesecake, so I sat down at the couch and wound up listening to music while browsing the internet on my phone. I was listening to Guns N' Roses, and I happened to think about how underrated Izzy Stradlin was as a guitarist. And that made me think about Izzy, Sadie's doll. I sat up and saw the doll was sitting on top of the armchair on the other side of the room, staring forward. I looked into her glass eyes and shuddered. They looked too alive but dead at the same time. That was one of the things I'd always hated about dolls, how they looked like they should be alive, but there was always something off that made them look wrong somehow. And then I remembered that Izzy was supposed to be upstairs, in Sadie's bed. How the hell had she gotten down here? I paused the song, cutting Axl Rose off mid-screech, and took my headphones off, wondering how the doll had managed to teleport downstairs. Maybe Sadie was playing a joke on me, but I was certain I would have noticed her coming down the stairs. They were right in my line of sight. Maybe she had never been in Sadie's bed, and my memory was just screwing with me. And the overly imaginative part of my mind told me that the doll must have come down the stairs herself, without anyone's help. And looking into her glassy eyes, I could almost imagine that being the true answer. With the only problem, of course, being that it was utterly ridiculous. As unsettling as they might be, the idea that a doll could walk down the stairs on its own was totally impossible. It was a damn piece of plastic. It couldn't think, let alone move. I started the song again and tried to ignore it. Maybe my head was just playing tricks on me, but I couldn't stop looking at the doll. It was always there, in the corner of my eye, and it always seemed to be watching me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I got up and walked back up the stairs. It felt wrong for me to turn my back on Izzy, though. I felt exposed, unsafe. I made my way to Sadie's room and pushed the door open. "Sadie?" I asked. "Yeah?" A slightly groggy voice answered. "Can I ask you something?" "What?" I stepped into the room and took a seat in the small chair next to her bed. "Can you tell me about Izzy? Where did you get her from?" "Mommy's friend gave her to me." Sadie's son. "Said she was a present." "Which friend?" I asked. "And how long ago?" "It was Auntie Ava, last year." I knew Ava. She'd been Tanya's best friend since before I was born. Apparently, Tanya had introduced her to Sadie as an aunt, which didn't surprise me too much. The two of them might as well have been sisters. Have you ever noticed anything weird about her? Auntie Ava? No, not her. The doll, Izzy. Sadie thought for a moment and then said, "Sometimes she talks to me. She told me her name was Izzy, and she moves around." My stomach dropped. Thanks. I'm gonna go, okay?" "Okay." I left Sadie's room, and my back felt even more exposed than it had before. As I walked down the hallway, I kept looking behind me, thinking something would be there, and I couldn't get Sadie's words out of my head. Maybe she was just imagining things. When I was 6, I would pretend my toys were alive and could talk to me. But that didn't explain how the doll could move on its own. I started walking down the stairs and made it about halfway before noticing that Izzy was no longer at the top of the armchair. She was sitting upright on the couch, exactly where I had been sitting. Nobody else was in the house. Nobody else could have touched her. Yet she had moved. Worse, her eyes no longer seemed to be staring blankly ahead. Instead, they seemed to be fixed on me, and a horrible feeling ran its claw up my spine, a feeling that told me that she could see me, and that she was watching. I didn't know what to do. I was tempted to run back up the stairs and into Sadie's room, lock the door, and camp out there. I considered calling Tanya and telling her what was going on, but she'd just call me insane. And then I told myself I was just being ridiculous. It was a doll. I wasn't going to run screaming away from it. I walked the rest of the way down the stairs and approached the doll, and I became more and more terrified with every step. I still felt like Izzy was watching me, and before long I was forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. and then I reached out to pick her up. Reaching out was even more difficult than approaching her. I didn't feel like I was about to grab a doll. I felt like I was about to put my hand in the jaws of a rabid Rottweiler. And part of me was certain that the moment I touched her, something awful would happen. But no. I put my hand around a plastic arm and sighed with relief when nothing happened. I picked Izzy up and stuffed her into a kitchen cupboard. Then, I tied the cupboard shut with several spare twist ties lying on the counter. Then I checked the time. It was about 7:30, so I still had several hours until Tanya and Alex would be back. I opened the fridge and helped myself to the cheesecake. If Tanya got mad, I could buy her more. And after Izzy's antics, I felt like I needed to eat something to calm down. I still felt uneasy, not quite safe, and I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to shake that feeling of exposure, of vulnerability. And then the cupboard giggled. If I had been standing up, I would have jumped 10 feet in the air. As it was, I sat bolt upright and spun to face the cupboard. Instinctively, I reached across the counter and grabbed a knife that had been left on the cutting board and pointed it in front of me, at Izzy's cupboard. And I waited to see what would happen next. Nothing. The cupboard was silent, and I didn't let go of the knife. I couldn't take my eyes off the cabinet. A minute passed, then 5. After 10 minutes had gone by, I finally set the knife down and dared to look away. Maybe my paranoid brain had just imagined the sound. It was at that moment that I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I still didn't feel comfortable leaving the room, but I figured that if I didn't, I would probably pee my pants if something like that happened again, which wasn't an appealing idea. It took less than a minute for me to relieve myself. I stepped out from the bathroom after washing my hands and looked back up at the cupboard. It was open. The twist ties had been split in two, and the doors were hanging open, revealing several dishes, but nothing else. Izzy was loose. Then I heard the footsteps. They were upstairs, and from down below I could hear them clearly. The light sound of little feet running down the hallway. "Sadie?" I called out, praying that it was only her, that she'd gotten up to use the bathroom herself or something. No answer. "Sadie?" Nothing. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. I bolted down the hallway and flung Sadie's door open. She was sleeping peacefully on her side, snoring softly through her nose. Thank God. I stepped further into her room, and that was when I heard the footsteps again, coming even closer. I turned to face the doorway. Izzy was there, sitting down, staring at the ground. Somehow that was just as unnerving as having her stare at me. In her lap was the knife I had pointed at her cupboard downstairs. And then her little plastic head slowly looked up, and those piercing blue eyes fixed themselves on me. Her arm moved ever so slightly, so that her hand was resting on the handle of the knife. I darted forward and slammed the door shut. I locked it and set the chair down in front of it. Sadie was still sleeping, and I didn't want to wake her. Who knew how she'd react to the situation? I pulled out my phone and called Tanya. She picked up on the third ring and asked, "Jake, what's going on?" "This is gonna sound totally insane," I said, "but you gotta believe me, okay?" "Okay, what happened?" "Sadie's doll, Izzy. She's been moving around the house all evening, disappearing and reappearing, and nobody's touching her. I'm in Sadie's room right now with the door locked, and the thing's sitting right outside the door with a knife. I saw it move," I said. Tanya was silent. I was certain that she was about to tell me I was crazy or laugh, but she didn't. After a few seconds, she spoke. "Is Sadie okay?" "Yeah, she's asleep in here. She doesn't know what's going on." "Good. Hold tight. We're coming. 15 minutes, okay?" "You believe me?" "Yeah, I do," Tanya said with such conviction in her voice that I knew she wasn't joking. "Just hold on." "I will," I said. She hung up. I knew there was probably only one reason why Tanya would believe me so quickly. She must have noticed the doll's antics herself. After a minute, she hung up. The tapping started. A gentle knock on the door, the sound of plastic against wood. It was a soft sound. I knew what had made it. A couple seconds later, the second knock came, then the third. Soon, the knocking was constant, and it began to get louder, building from a gentle knock into a loud thud. Izzy wanted in, and she wanted in bad. As if she knew playtime was almost over, I threw myself against the door, pushing back, praying the lock would hold. And then I heard the sound of the garage door opening and let out a massive sigh of relief. Tanya and Alex were back. The knocking had stopped, but I still didn't dare open the door. I heard Alex yell, "Hello?" from downstairs. "Up here," I shouted back. Sadie turned in her sleep when I yelled. I could hear footsteps from outside the room. Heavy footsteps that could have only belonged to my sister or her husband. I dared to unlock the door and peer out. Tanya was standing at the other end of the hallway, staring at me. I opened the door all the way and stepped down. Izzy was lying on her back, right in front of the door. Her eyes were blank and empty again, and the knife was lying a few inches away from her. Tanya walked to stand next to me as Alex ran up the stairs. All three of us stared at the doll for a moment, as if daring it to react. "Where's Sadie?" Alex asked eventually. "In here," I said. "Still sleeping, like I said. She doesn't know what's going on." "Good, so what do we do with it?" Alex asked. "I don't know," Tanya said. "Burn it?" "Does plastic burn?" I asked. "I don't know. I guess we'll find out." Tanya said. She turned to me and said, "Thanks for keeping Sadie safe." "No problem. I did eat some of the cheesecake, though. Is that okay?" "Given the circumstances, I can't blame you," Tanya said. "I know what to do," Alex said. "We'll bury her." "Good idea. Let's do it deep." Alex went to get a garbage bag to bury Izzy in, leaving Tanya and I to talk. "Why did you believe me so fast? Have you been noticing things too?" "Yeah, for the past 2 months or so. Sadie's had her for a year, but I didn't start noticing things until recently. She appears in new places, and Sadie would talk about Izzy telling her things. When you called, I knew you were telling the truth." I asked Sadie, and she said Ava gave Izzy to her. "Did she say anything about that?" I asked. "Izzy used to belong to Ava's own niece," Tanya said. "She told me that her niece didn't want Izzy anymore because she gave her nightmares. Ava and her brother both assumed that she was just being childish, but here we are." It felt strange to talk so casually about something so unusual, something so impossible, but somehow, the impossibility of the situation felt unimportant. It was real, so the fact that it shouldn't have been didn't matter. "Can I go?" I asked Tanya. "Like, if it's alright, I want to go back home." "Of course," Tanya said. "What are you going to tell Mom and Dad?" "Nothing. They wouldn't believe us." "I guess you're right." Tanya shrugged. "Bye, Jake." "Bye, Tanya." I drove home, and even though it was only 8:15, I went to bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. When I finally did, I had the most horrific nightmares. I don't think I'll be able to sleep without nightmares for a long time. This morning, Tanya texted me a photo of the spot where they buried Izzy. Hopefully she won't be able to escape from under 6 feet of dirt. God, I hope she can't. Doppelgangers aren't like what you see in the movies. They aren't interested in holding you captive and stealing your life. They aren't linked to you by some supernatural bond either. The only part about you that interests them is your taste. They're easy enough to spot if you know what you're looking for, but letting your guard down for even a moment can be a deadly mistake. That's something my family had to learn the hard way. It was around 6 p.m. when I first realized something was wrong. I sat on the couch, head in my hands. I'd typed out a text message about a half hour earlier, but still couldn't find the strength to hit send. I picked the phone up from the coffee table, and after staring at it a moment, put it back down again. I'd done this so many times I could swear there was a phone-shaped indent in the wood. Come on, Paul, I mumbled to myself. It's just like ripping off a Band-Aid. Again, I picked up the phone. After taking a deep breath, I finally pressed enter. The message was simple. It's over. It didn't take long for Stephanie to answer. LOL, you said that last week. I furrowed my brow. I'm serious. I'm telling Wendy everything. I saw her start typing, stop for a long moment, and then start again. She'll leave you, you know. You'll never see Henry again. This wasn't news to me. I'd spent countless sleepless nights agonizing over that thought. Even so, seeing it in her text hit me hard. She always tried to get in my head like this, but for once, I didn't take the bait. And I'll deserve it, I said. I powered the phone down before she could respond and shoved it in my pocket, out of sight. I suddenly heard the rumbling of Wendy's car coming into the driveway, which immediately made my heart rate spike. The keys began turning in the lock. Like a Band-Aid, I thought again. The door opened and I steadied my breath. Hey, sweetie, do you think we could talk for a... Her voice was buzzing with excitement. Hold that thought, babe. I have something special for you. I just blinked and stared at her dumbfoundedly. Great. What is it? She thrust a pink paper bag into my arms. Open it, she practically shouted. I hesitantly pushed my arm into the bag and fished out a box. Inside it was another smaller box. I gave her a look and she just smiled. Keep going. I did as I was told and discovered my present. Inside of the box was a positive pregnancy test. I instantly felt my resolve melt away. She looked at me expectantly, and I stretched my face into a wide grin. This is... I struggled for the words. Amazing. She wrapped her arms around me. I know, right? Henry will be so excited. What were you saying before? My mouth went dry. I don't really remember. She let go of me and headed for the hallway. Let me know if you think of it. I just stared at the floor. I'd already partially come to grips with losing Henry, but this reopened the wound. I entertained the possibility of telling her eventually, but in the back of my mind, I knew I'd never be able to go through with it. Not now. I was considering all this when Wendy said something that gave me pause. I'm getting Henry. We're going out to celebrate right now. I raised my eyebrow. He's not with you? Thought you were picking him up today. She stopped and turned around. Oh, did you forget already? You called me and said that you'd take care of it. Now, I was genuinely confused. I'm forgetful, but I've got a couple more decades at least before dementia starts setting in. When did that happen? About a half hour ago. After thinking a moment, I remembered something weird, but my phone's been missing a week, remember? The phone I'd used to talk to Stephanie was a secret burner phone. It didn't even have Wendy's number on it. She smiled and raised an eyebrow. Well, someone left me this message. She quickly produced her phone and played back the voicemail. The voice I heard was my own, clear as crystal. Hey, sweetie, text me anything you want from the store and don't worry about Henry. I'll pick him up on the way back. The message startled me. Was I going crazy? When Wendy saw the confusion in my eyes, her skepticism gave way to concern. Who else could it have been? I frantically threw on my jacket. I don't know, but whoever it is, they're on their way to Henry's school. I rushed out of the house and into the car. As I sped down the empty street, terrible possibilities played on an endless loop in my head. By the time I screeched into the elementary school parking lot, dismissal was already well underway. I scanned the sea of faces for any sign of Henry, but it was hopeless. I was on the cusp of a full-on breakdown when I spotted a crop of familiar orange hair a few yards away. A second later, I caught a glimpse of Henry's face and relief washed over me. However, when I called him, the sound was drowned out by the screams and chatter of the crowd. As I pushed through the sea of parents and children, I saw that Henry wasn't alone. A man was holding his hand and quickly leading him toward the road. I gave another desperate cry. Henry! This time, he turned around. Henry looked puzzled after seeing me and kept looking back and forth between the man and I. Daddy? The man yanked him violently, and that seemed to snap him from his trance. Henry slipped from his grasp and dove into my arms, burying his face in my chest. I wiped moisture from my cheeks and realized I had been crying. Please don't ever do that again. Henry pointed at the man. But he looked like you. I looked up and caught a glimpse of the stranger right before he ducked into the car. Then he was gone as soon as he appeared, speeding down the street and rounding a corner. After checking every inch of Henry to make sure he wasn't hurt, I led him back to my car. Listen, buddy, I said, before you leave with someone, you need to be absolutely sure they're me, okay? Henry's face grew sullen. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. And you're sure he looked exactly like me? Henry squeezed his eyes shut and nodded emphatically. I sighed. It was all so impossible. I kept expecting myself to wake up on the couch in a cold sweat. How would I explain this to Wendy? I gasped. Wendy. She was back at the house all alone. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but it didn't stop me from pressing down the accelerator. The two of us made it back to the house in record time. Henry started unbuckling his seatbelt, but I stopped him. Stay here no matter what, I said. I crept up to the door and found it covered in boot marks as if someone had been trying to kick it open. Looking down, I discovered muddy prints leading to a smashed window. Ignoring the alarm bells sounding in my head, I unlocked the door and slowly swung it open. The sunlight did little to illuminate the dimness of the living room. With what little light there was, I could make out a toppled bookcase and a few scattered papers. Not good. I eventually found Wendy lying in the kitchen, slumped over like a puppet with no strings. A bruise was blossoming under her eye, and there were several bloody cuts on her face and arms. The sight of her simultaneously broke my heart and filled me with rage. I reached out to her, but she recoiled from my touch and shrieked. Calm down, I whispered. It's just me. I was cut off by a banana hitting me in the forehead. I blinked. Wendy was throwing anything within arm's reach at me. I know exactly who you are. Just get the hell away from me. Apparently out of all the fruits to throw, she grabbed a nearby kitchen knife. My eyes widened, and I put my hands up defensively. No, just listen. Whoever attacked you wasn't me. Henry almost went off with a stranger today. He said the guy looked exactly like me. She lowered the knife, but didn't drop it. Where's Henry now? In the car. We need to get him out of here quickly. She eyed me hesitantly. I racked my brain for a way to prove it. When he attacked you, was he wearing this? I asked, indicating my outfit. She looked me up and down before shaking her head slowly. I guess not. And you must have fought back. I motioned at the blood under her fingernails. I don't have a single scratch on me. Listen, I know how insane it sounds, but I think some guy's been running around pretending to be me. Remember how my phone got stolen? He was the one who took it. He was the one who left you the voicemail. And he was the one who did this to you. I slowly held out my hand for her. You have to trust me. After a moment, she finally put the knife down and let me help her to her feet. Henry's scream suddenly pierced through the quiet of the kitchen. Wendy and I looked at each other before rushing into the living room. Henry stood in the middle of the room, pale as a ghost and staring at the door to the basement. Wendy's voice was frantic. What happened? Henry pointed a shaky finger at the door. Daddy's face was backwards. What do you mean, sweetie? I took a hesitant step toward the basement door. It means there's something down there. Henry grabbed my sleeve. Don't go, Daddy. He's bad. I chuckled quietly. I know he is, buddy. Stay close to Mommy, okay? I creaked open the door and took a step inside the inky darkness. As I descended, my mind raced with possibilities of who might be waiting for me down there. Backwards face? The hell did that mean? By the time my feet landed on the cold, cement floor, I was shaking almost uncontrollably. The room was veiled in a wall of darkness, but I could just barely make out a figure at the other end of the room, perfectly still. As my fingers probed the wall for the light switch, my eyes stayed glued to the thing in the corner. As I slowly adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was sitting. Or was it crouched? My hand finally found the switch, and I flicked it up frantically. The room was filled with light, and my eyes met the figure that had been watching me. At first, I didn't know what to make of the bloody pile of skin and hair that sat in front of me. Although it was ragged and mangled, I could make out arms and legs, like an empty Halloween costume from hell. The face held dark chasms where the eyes and mouth should have been. I edged a few inches closer and confirmed what I'd suspected. It was a face. It was my face. Mingled with the blood was grayish-blue fluid that formed a trail along the floor. I followed it until eventually it stopped at an open laundry chute. After a moment of thought, I realized something that made my heart drop. The chute led straight to the living room. The living room my family was standing in. Spinning on my heel, I began bolting up the stairs. Dread seized my body. While I was in the basement playing hero, my family might have been up there getting torn to shreds by that thing. Throwing open the door, I was met with an empty living room. I peered through a window, hoping to see them waiting for me outside, but they weren't there. Realizing they must be somewhere in the house, I began making my way into the dark halls. As I passed by fallen family portraits and broken vases, I couldn't help but fear the worst. I tried opening the door to Wendy's bedroom, but it had been locked. "Open up, it's me," I whispered. After a moment, the door creaked open and Wendy quickly grabbed me inside. "Thank God you're here," she hissed. It wasn't until I entered that I saw the condition Wendy and Henry were in. To my shock, they were both covered in a network of crisscrossing scratch marks. Wendy was clinging to a fire poker, something she'd no doubt picked up while trying to fight off whatever was in the house. I quickly locked the door behind me. "What happened to you both?" She blinked back tears. "Something attacked us. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't an animal either. I know it's dark, but I swear whatever it was didn't have any..." "Any what?" "Skin." She put her head in her hands. "Does that sound crazy?" I shook my head and told her about what I'd found in the basement. After I was done, she said something that caught me off guard. "What do you think it looks like now?" I shot her a puzzled look and she continued. "Well, it made itself look like you. What if it looks like someone else now?" I thought for a moment. I guess that's true. But wouldn't it be long gone by now, looking for another host? She held Henry a little tighter. "I guess." I stood up. "Well, come on, let's get the hell out of here." She didn't move. "Why do you think it didn't attack you?" There was a long, ugly pause. "It was already gone by the time I got there. Now can we please get out?" "I'm not going out there with..." "With me?" "With that creature." I took a step toward her and she raised her hands defensively, one of them still holding the fire poker. "Please don't get any closer." I sighed. "Wendy, I get it. You're scared. I am too, but you have to trust me." She seemed like she was easing up until Henry threw me a curveball. "Look," he shouted, pointing at my pocket. "Daddy found his phone." After some brief confusion, I realized he was talking about the burner phone. I pulled it out and they didn't seem to tell the difference. It took Wendy only a second to realize the implications. She raised a shaky finger at it, nudging Henry behind her. "How do you get that?" I tried to sound innocent. "What do you mean?" She took another step back. "It was stolen, remember? It's what that thing used to send me the fake voicemail. How do you even have it?" "No, this isn't the same phone. It's just a..." I stopped myself. If I told her it was a burner phone, she'd know about the affair. She raised the fire poker slightly. "Just a what?" I edged toward her. "Listen, Wendy, I'll tell you. Just give me the fire poker." She swung it at me, more as a warning. "Get back. Answer the question. Just what?" We were about 5 feet apart. her back nearly against the wall. I desperately tried to make my voice as soothing as possible. I promise I'll answer all of your questions as soon as you give me that thing. She swung again, a little harder this time. I wanted so desperately to just tell her and end this, but I couldn't do it. I wasn't ready to lose her. I wasn't ready to lose my family. And I wouldn't have to if I could just get that damn fire poker. I made a grab for it, but it whizzed through the air in an instant, slicing through my hand. I cried out and inspected the wound. Growling with anger, I made a lunge for her. She shrieked and blindly thrust the fire poker forward. I twisted my body to avoid it and tackled her to the ground. I had almost pinned her arms down when my breathing became ragged. Before I knew it, I toppled over. After some confusion, I looked at my chest and realized what had happened. The fire poker had hit its mark after all. Through slightly blurred vision, I watched Wendy push herself onto wobbly legs and scoop Henry into her arms. I breathed in shakily and wheezed. "Burner." She gave me a bewildered look. "What are you talking about?" "It's not my phone. It's a burner." After a brief coughing fit, I continued. "I had an affair. I couldn't tell you." "Oh my God," she screamed at me, her eyes welling with tears. "You idiot. Why would you wait until now to tell me?" I just stared at the window. Strange colors were dancing in front of my eyes. If the creature isn't disguised as you, then where is it? I barely considered her words at first, just letting them wash over me. Then I realized something that made my eyes bulge. I tried to tell her, but I broke into a coughing fit. As Wendy tried desperately to decipher what I was saying, Henry slowly opened his mouth, revealing row upon row of tiny, needle-like teeth. I always thought that finding a job after I graduated college would be easy, but I soon found out that that wasn't the case. After months of searching, I was finally able to find a job as a correctional officer at my local prison. I put in my application the next day and was hired on the spot. I started training, and for those 2 weeks, everything seemed normal. When the time came for me to choose which shift I wanted to go to, I chose the midnight to 8 a.m. shift. I was a night owl, so I knew the shift would be perfect for me. On my first night, I was put into our restricted housing unit, RHU for short. This was the unit for the inmates that misbehaved or broke institutional rules. When I entered the unit, I was met with 2 doors. One door led onto the actual unit, while the other led to a little room that I assumed was where I would be sitting in for the night if I wasn't doing my security rounds. I went to the door that led to the little room and waited for the officer inside to open it. Once I heard the mechanics of the door opening, I pulled on the door to open it fully. Upon entering the room, I was met with the 4 to 12 officer. They were sitting in front of a desk with a computer on it. Behind that desk were 4 windows that looked into the unit itself. When I looked at the computer, I saw a layout of the unit along with a bunch of icons that looked like locks. I remembered from my training that those icons were how we opened the doors in the unit. Behind where the officer was sitting was a bathroom. I was grateful for that because I would be stuck in this room unless I was doing a security round. The 4 to 12 officer informed me of how many inmates I had before leaving me to my own devices. I sat down in the chair that they were previously sitting in and looked at the computer in front of me. That's when I noticed the post-it note on the bottom of the computer monitor. 12 to 8 shift. Please read the instructions saved to the computer before you do your first round. I raised an eyebrow in confusion, but looked on the computer for these instructions anyway. I minimized the unit layout to see a single file on the desktop titled Night Shift. I double-clicked on it, and a Word document opened up. Welcome to the night shift. I'm sure that you are very eager to get started with your first night, but there are some rules you need to be aware of before you can begin. Please read them carefully to ensure no mistakes are made. Rule number 1. Make sure that you do not do any security rounds between 1:30 a.m. and 1:42 a.m. Rule number 2. At exactly 2:17 a.m., you are to enter the bathroom behind you and lock the door. No matter what you hear from outside the bathroom, do not exit the bathroom until 2:23 a.m. Rule number 3. An officer will enter your unit at some point through the night. Do not, under any circumstances, open any doors for him. He will leave after 5 minutes. Rule number 4. At exactly 4:15 a.m., you are to open all the cells in the unit. Once they are open, hide under the desk. The inmates will make it past the unit door, but they will not be able to make it past the room door. No matter what you hear from outside, do not come out from under the desk until 5:20 a.m. Rule number 5. At 5:40 a.m., a cart of food trays will be delivered to you. Pass them out like you learned during training. Leave the unit as soon as you are done, and do not re-enter until 6:07 a.m. Get the trays out at that time, then do a security round right after. Rule number 6. At 7 a.m., a nurse will come in to distribute medication to the inmates. You are to accompany her inside the unit, but do not speak to her, and do not make eye contact with her. After she leaves the unit, come straight back to this room and stay here until your relief arrives at 8 a.m. I read back through the rules again, but couldn't believe what I was reading. They had to be joking, right? I sighed and looked at my watch to see that the time was 1:15. I had enough time to do a security round before 1:30. I opened the door to the room I was in and walked out. Once I closed the door behind me, the door leading into the unit opened up automatically. I walked into the unit with the device the prison provided so that I could scan the red tags that were placed around the unit. Once I was finished, I walked off the unit and went back into the room. I secured the door behind me right as the clock read 1:30. Suddenly, all the lights in the unit went out, causing me to jump slightly. I glanced out the windows into the unit to see if I could make out anything, but the only light going into the unit now was from the room that I was in. I could make out the faint outline of the cells, but then I saw something move out of the corner of my eye near the showers. When I looked over at the showers, I saw the silhouette of someone just standing in front of them. As my eyes focused more on the figure, I could tell that it was actually facing towards me. I glanced away for a second to see that the clock read 1:39. When I looked back, the figure was closer, and I could actually see what it looked like. There were only black sockets where its eyes should be. The nose was only an empty cavity, like that on a human skull. The mouth was what sent a chill up my spine. The smile that the figure wore was a wide smile that stretched from ear to ear. I could see the rotting, almost black teeth as the figure slowly started making its way toward the windows. My heart started pounding faster as the figure got closer and closer. Right as it reached the windows, the lights in the unit turned back on and the figure vanished instantly. I looked at the clock. It was 1:42. I took a deep, shaky breath before sitting down in the chair. I looked at the computer to see if any of the cells had been opened, but they all showed that they were closed and secure. Where did that thing come from? What was even happening in this prison? I rubbed my hand over my face and shut my eyes for a few seconds to compose myself. I no sooner had shut my eyes when the sound of knocking brought me out of my thoughts. I looked over to see an officer standing at the doorway waiting to be let in. I remembered one of the rules that said that the officer would leave after 5 minutes. I looked at my watch, and it read 1:52. The officer started knocking violently on the door, but I did my best to ignore him since I knew that he wouldn't be here for very long. I looked at the computer and just kept my eyes forward as the officer continued to bang on the door. Soon, out of the corner of my eye, the banging stopped. I glanced at the clock on the computer to see that it was 1:57. I turned towards the door, but the officer was gone. The only thing is, I never heard the main door open. Was it all in my head? I whispered. Was it just my imagination? I pushed the thought to the back of my mind and went to do another security round. As I was doing my round, I started to hear what sounded like scratching coming from outside in the exercise yard. I looked down at my watch and my eyes widened when I saw that it was 2:17. The second rule. I completely lost track of time. The sound of the exercise yard slider starting to open brought me out of my thoughts, and I broke out into a sprint as I made my way out of the unit. I could hear something chasing after me, but I was able to make it out of the unit and back into the room. Right as I shut the door behind me, something slammed into the door. It was something I've only seen in my nightmares. I let out a scream as the creature pressed itself against the window that was in the door. It had long, slender arms, large hands, and slender fingers. The face of this creature looked like a mummy that they had taken out of an old tomb. My eyes widened as the creature started to bang against the window with its large hands. What scared me even more was that the glass was starting to crack. I snapped out of shock and went into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I locked it and sat on the floor with my back pressed against the door. The sound of breaking glass made my heart stop and my blood run cold. It had gotten into the room. I could hear it crawling around trying to find me. My watch read that it was 2:20. Minutes seemed like hours before the sound of the exercise yard slider closing was the only sound filling the air. It was 2:23. I slowly opened the door to see if the creature was gone. All I saw in the room was the broken glass of the window. Fear overtook me as I thought about the fourth rule. All the cells had to be opened, and the inmates were going to be able to get through that unit door, and in turn, get through that broken window. So now, here I sit, typing this out on the computer in this room. I want everyone to know what happened to me if I go missing. I thought working the night shift would be easy, but now, it's 4:15 a.m. and I just opened the cells. The inmates are swarming the unit door, almost a look of hunger in their eyes. The unit door is starting to give with all the strength that these inmates have. The inmates have gotten through the door. I've been having dreams about that summer. Persistent dreams. I can't fall asleep without seeing my dad's face. It's why I started seeing a therapist in the first place. Because of those dreams. Those fucking dreams. They always start when I first saw the theme park, where in his office, I must have been sad because he claps me on the back and says, "There's no reason to cry. No reason at all." His voice scratches at my ears. That I remember. There's little I remember of my father. Lee says that has something to do with trauma, but I don't think so. He was quiet when I was young and absent when I was older. That did more to cover him up than anything he did. But he did a lot of things. My dad owned the theme park. He built it. He bought some old farmer's property and built a roller coaster on it. I don't know whether it was the divorce that caused it or it caused the divorce. It's not like I can ask. He wasn't even planning on even selling tickets to the place at first. My dad was never particularly stable. My mom got full custody for the first few years after the divorce, and he moved halfway across the country as soon as the papers were filed. That's where he built it. They negotiated terms when I was about 11. I would stay with him during the summers, but I stayed at my old school. That always made sense to me. Summer was peak season. He built the roller coaster first. I remember that. He hired a bunch of contractors, painted it green, and then called it Nessie. That thing broke down 3 times a week, I swear to God. I can't believe they even let us keep it running. That thing was a death trap. Then came the carnival games. Those types of things with water guns and 2 small hoops. He hired a couple townies to do that. To man the stands, too. It's been a while. A long while. I'm sorry if I don't get everything right. It all blew up from there. We had more attractions when I was 17. There were bumper cars themed like a circus, with elephants and clowns and chipped paint. Those were always popular. His favorite was the Tunnel of Love. I don't think we ever got more than 6 people to ride on that a day. I guess I should say why I said we. My dad, even though he was very well off, was a cheap fuck. Or maybe he was trying to get closer to me. I don't know. I don't know a lot about my dad looking back. Whatever it was, He made me work there throughout the summer. He never left the park, I swear. He would just hand me the keys to his place and then say he'd get back when he could. Always came home at 1 in the morning and left at 5. He always went back to the park, setting everything up, doing paperwork. I was 17 when it happened. I had already decided by then, by the time I left that place and turned 18, I would never look back. I hated that fucking theme park. I hated it so much. It was all he could talk about, too. He always said the place had a history, even though he built it 10 years before. That summer, I was mainly running the bumper cars and the coaster, as my dad squirreled himself in an office at the edge of the property. I know everyone who worked there that summer. There weren't ever more than 20 in the best years, but that year we had 13. I was the only one from out of town. Everyone else was from the surrounding area. Townies, my dad called them, as if he hadn't been a history professor 11 years earlier. There were about 5 of us that always hung out and fucked around. There was Chuck, who went to the college nearby and needed extra cash. There was Landon, a year older than me, who was always the odd man out, with his black dyed hair and metal t-shirts, and who we knew nothing about. We always joked with increasingly unconvincing tales about his family life. There was Sarah, who worked there since I did, but legally, minors were almost certainly not allowed to be doing the stuff I was doing around the park. So she was 22, at least. Then there was Lucy. This was her first year at the park, and I was crushing on her hard. I could barely get a sentence finished around her. It was almost sad, really, how much I fell for this girl within the first week. Chuck and Sarah teased me mercilessly. I can't remember her voice. It's crazy what you forget. It's like a silent movie when I think about her. But I know she had a pretty voice. God, I don't know what she's doing now. I hope she's alright. I know we never talked after that summer. How could we, really? How could anyone? I'm getting ahead of myself again. Every time I try to tell this story, I just jump to the end. What else am I supposed to jump to? I shouldn't. I know. Lee says that doesn't help with the sessions. It just makes me relive the trauma without contextualizing it. It just sounds like a bunch of bullshit to me. I remember that summer a lot when I actually try to think about it. I can remember the way the paint peeled off of the sign. I can remember the way that one bumper car, Red 3, kept breaking down because a couple of kids always managed to slam it against the wall at full force. I can remember the day the first kid disappeared. It was bright and sunny. The place was overrun with locals. I was leaning against the control panel for the coaster as some guy barfed up his cotton candy a couple feet left of me. She came up to me crying. God, she was crying. She wasn't worried or angry or scared. She was already distraught. Did she know? Somehow? Did she figure it out? She ran up to me and screamed about some lost kid. I called into my walkie-talkie. Chuck made some joke about it, which she heard and started crying louder about. Not here, he says. I check with Andrew, who's manning the customer relations desk, which is our bullshit name for a help kiosk. Not here, he says. I check with Sarah on the bumper cars, see if they have any kids running around there. Not here, she says. I check around concessions. Not there. I check around walkie-talkies for another 5 minutes before we do a search. It takes an hour before we call the cops. My dad shut down the park early that day. To help the investigation, he said. I can remember how he said it, and I can smell the whiskey on his breath. The police searched for 3 hours, in the park and the woods around, as this mother's wailing the whole time. I can remember how that sounds. It's stuck in my head. I don't think I'll ever forget it. They called off the search at midnight, I heard. They say they'll fully search the woods in the morning. My dad came home on time that night. He slept soundly. The police do it again in the morning, with less effort, but they don't find him. Nobody ever saw that kid again. It's a sad thing, sure, but that's happened before. Sometimes people disappear. It's sad, but you keep on going. The next 3 weeks pass in a flash. I remember the energy of the place afterward. All of us were shaken up by it, but Lucy was definitely the worst off of all of us. She had never really done that sort of stuff before, and all this missing kid stuff messed with her bad. I remember Chuck making a joke about it, and then she left in a huff. Must have been 30 out. We were closing up for the night. It was the first time we really talked. We had made jokes or whatever, but that's when we actually started to trust each other. We started dating a week later. I don't remember how it started, but I knew I was happy. For a brief moment, I had a normal summer. The second kid disappeared not long after that. It was a dad this time. A single father, worried out of his mind. Thomas Earhart. I remember seeing the kid getting cotton candy and then running around. I saw a lot of kids around there, but I remember him. Red hair, glasses, teeth missing from his mouth. I don't know why I remember that kid. Memory's a strange thing, and sometimes it picks up only the least important stuff. That time, it caught him. I was watching him. I know that. Something about him struck me. I guess it's a sort of intuition. He vanished into the crowd. Thomas Earhart. I remember his name even now. I remember the picture the cops showed me. That same kid smiling, happy, with a family. There were 2 sisters, 2 parents. They were so happy. God, they were so fucking happy. He was never seen again. He vanished into that crowd, screaming, laughing, and then we never saw him again. It was the same routine. We searched for an hour and then the police were called and then nothing. They took our statements and then found nothing. They always say I had the problem of not seeing it sooner, but the cops had the same information I did. They knew what I knew. They did nothing. I'm getting out of order. I jumped to the end, but I know I don't want to go there. Not yet. After Thomas disappeared, I was reassigned. I had been working on bumper cars for the past 2 weeks, but I got reassigned. My dad put Chuck on the bumper cars because he caught me smoking outside the back of the park. He always hated me smoking, called it morally abhorrent, that it would tear up my lungs. They were his cigarettes. He reassigned me to the tunnel of love because he knew I hated it. I was overjoyed. Lucy was working just next door. Every second I wasn't watching the tunnel, I would let the controls go on autopilot and then flirt with her. Of course, when it didn't break down. That thing broke down every fucking day. Even when it couldn't have had more than a dozen people going on it a day. I guess I should explain the ride just a little bit. It was a dark ride. A slow meandering trot through the world of love. Whatever kishy bullshit that is. There was the disgusting river of water below the boats, as the boat moved from room to room, so you could admire the scenery. It was never my thing. I don't think it was anyone's thing. It just was. My dad had to have put a lot of money into it. There were the dioramas, the little paintings on the walls, and a second track to put the boats on for maintenance. That second track was really just a tunnel into a storage area. A couple of dilapidated props, and some shit he had bought from a garage sale. And then there were the animatronics. I hated those animatronics. Big cartoon animals, pink and with hearts everywhere. There were teddy bears and chickens and all these animals with eyes that were too fucking big. They gave kids nightmares whenever they went on it. And couples, who were the only consistent group to go on it, never came back after they saw those things. I told my dad to take them out so many times. Just let it be a dark ride. But he couldn't let that happen. My dad was a mess at home and in his office. But he obsessed over the tunnel. He couldn't do anything but think about that thing. That's why it reeked of cleaning supplies. He was cleaning it every single day, whenever it was closed, even as people dipped from one room to ride to another. This was his small world, and he wasn't going to let me ruin that. It was something compulsive. We knew that. He had been like that around certain rooms of the house before the divorce. I worked on that ride for the rest of the summer. It was supposed to be completely normal, even after those kids disappeared. We'd had something bad like that before, but never together. The police kept looking, but an officer on the premises wasn't a common sight anymore. They told us that they believed it was just a random occurrence, that these two got lost at the same time. Told us to keep a lookout. That was supposed to be it. I began thinking of getting out of there again. I told myself I'd work another year, maybe move out here, even though I hated the place, because Lucy and I were starting to seem somewhat serious. Even though it had only been a month and a half. We were kids. Everything seemed like it would last forever. The third kid disappeared at the end of June. A girl. Her name was Charlotte. I remember all of their names. The police swarmed the place then, and we had to shut down the place. My dad hated that. He was a cheap fuck, and losing a whole day, even to this, seemed like the loss of the century. That was the first time I saw Detective Green. I'll call him that because his name was kind of like that. Big guy, big, bald guy, probably around 300 pounds, 6'3". My dad was dwarfed by him. Detective Green told us that there was an active investigation. Landon, the weirdo, had a cousin on the force. He was the one who told me they thought it was somebody who did it. 3 kids disappearing within 2 months wasn't a coincidence anymore. That made my stomach sink. Even though I hated the place, I still felt a little for my dad. He put his whole life in this place, and if they shut it down, a week with the low overheads could kill the place. I know that probably wasn't what I should have first thought of. Those were kids. They vanished. Disappeared. I still think of Thomas first. Red hair, glasses, disappearing into the crowd. He seemed invincible, running around. And I couldn't imagine someone wanting to hurt that kid. I couldn't comprehend it. That any of these people, wandering throughout the park, could have done it. Hundreds of strangers. Hundreds of suspects. The whole thing scared me, even though I wouldn't have admitted it. We were all pretty messed up about it. Lucy, especially. Everyone except Landon. Landon had always been weird. Loved true crime, horror movies, anything scary. He was a year or 2 older than me. We went to the university nearby, I think. We barely talked to him, I'll be honest, because Landon always creeped us out. He was a friend, I guess, but I knew we talked shit about him a lot. We were kids. I feel awful about how we treated him. We knew better. At least, we should have. Landon was never weirded out by all these disappearances, even as much as we were. I'll never forget what he told me when talking about it one day. It was bound to happen sometime. I never liked talking to Landon. Police swarmed the place after they shut it down. We still work there some days, but they shut it down to any public presence. They didn't want to contaminate the evidence, or whatever, but they had no proof that the kids were anywhere on the property. The woods outside the park were just short of being a state park. The rangers were looking for those kids day and night. And having an officer in the park wouldn't have done anything. I wonder if Detective Green did that for a reason. I have no real clue what went on in that guy's head. Not even now. All I know is that he weirded me out. A lot of things weirded me out. Maybe it was just the circumstances, but Green would always look at me like I was a monster. We worked on the park, just checking the rides, making sure that everything was functional. That was the only concession my dad could wring out of the cops. If the park's rides broke down while closed, and we didn't get to them until reopening, we'd be fucked. That I was alright with. I needed that check. Moving out of my mom's house was never going to be cheap. It's funny. I was focused on the future, those days, and now I can't stop thinking about the past. They promised they'd reopen the park after 2 weeks if they didn't find anything. They checked that place from head to toe. The roller coaster, the bumper cars, the back shed, the offices, even taking a glance around the Tunnel of Love. But they didn't find a thing. Not a shred. The police department shifted towards combing through the forest, but everyone in town knew they had fucked up. If they had focused on the forest in the first place, then those kids wouldn't have had more time to fall into the caverns or vanish into the woods. 3 kids disappearing around the same time in a theme park is a horrific coincidence, we said. We were trying to rationalize it because we couldn't believe that someone could have taken those kids. I remember all 5 of us hanging out, smoking outside of a convenience store way past midnight. It was the hottest August night I can remember. My dad would have either been asleep or at work by then. Either way, he wouldn't have noticed I was gone. We were dumb kids. I remember that. We thought the world was going to be ours, and that seemed so realistic. I thought I was going to make something of myself. That summer killed a lot of things in me. Lucy always made me feel like everything was going to be all right. That's why I liked her at first. She kept me at ease. We were smoking in the parking lot and talking about how the police fucked this up. 3 kids. 3 kids missing. I don't remember who said it, but someone got the idea we should go into the theme park, do some detective work ourselves. Maybe it was just because we were stoned out of our minds, but it seemed like a good idea. At least to half of us. Landon thought it was stupid, ran off, and Sarah had no interest in sulking around that place any more at night than she did at day. That left Chuck, me, and Lucy. But she barely wanted to go. The place looked so much worse. In the day, it was charming and a bit rickety, but at night, all the wrong things stood out. The shadows of the coaster were silhouetted black against the dark blue sky. The only thing lit was the "Do Not Enter" sign. A little hint of brightness among the night. The whole thing gave me creeps. I don't let myself show it. Chuck turned back as soon as we had come, leaving the 2 of us. "Fuck this," he said. We should have followed him away. I fished a flashlight from my glove compartment and flicked it on, bathing the fence in the flickering light. I remember that too. I remember the way the light glittered off of the fence, shining in the night. We tried to push the gate open, but my dad had locked it with a chain. He didn't want anyone to get in. I navigated around the fence, searching for a hole in the place. Lucy told me to give up, but I kept urging her forward. The fucker doing this is too scared to get anyone besides kids. I was an asshole back then. It took me about 15 minutes before we found a hole in the mesh. I could barely fit through, even though I wasn't the tallest. Lucy followed in after me, clutching at my arm. She was shivering in the heat. We took to the bumper cars first. Their shadows were massive with the flashlight, drenching the walls in dark. All the magic, the bare hint of it my father had managed to accumulate, vanished in the harsh shadows and light of the night. My teeth began to chatter when I remembered the girl, Charlotte. She had vanished around the bumper cars. We continued walking, but I stopped talking. Lucy was right about this, I realized then. I never should have gone there. We went to the darts next, then the concessions. Lucy saw a rat by the cotton candy and screamed to high heaven. We went to the roller coaster, but that had been shut down for repairs a week earlier. Everything was always breaking down. Everything. They were patchwork reconstruction, barely able to continue going. I don't think my dad spent more than a penny on that place looking back. It's like he wanted it all to end with an accident. We wandered throughout the whole park, ducking under cobwebs and searching into the corners my dad wouldn't want us to go. We looked through his office, this short, fat building that could see the rest of the park, hidden next to the log flume. The door was locked, but if you jiggled the window just right, you could get it to open. I'd done that a dozen times to steal rum from his cabinet. It was covered with papers head to toe. It looked like the place had been ripped apart. If the police really had been investigating thoroughly, maybe that was their work. Detective Green had probably read every single document in here. The place looked like a tornado had gone through. We got out of there quick. I didn't want to linger and leave a trace. My dad was methodical. My stomach twisted up as soon as we got back outside. As soon as I noticed it. "Do you smell that?" she had said. And I can still see her there, standing in the night. The wind was blowing from the north end of the park. Bleach. I started walking towards the tunnel of love, not even thinking about what I was doing. Everything goes in slow motion as I looked back on it. It feels like it took an eternity to walk from my dad's office to the tunnel. I told myself that there was nothing to fear. Nothing had gone wrong. It didn't stop my stomach from twisting up further. I was never that good of a liar, not even to myself. In the day, it had been maybe a bit rickety, but it looked like haunted in the middle of the night. The smell of bleach overtook me. Couldn't have been that long since it was sprayed. Minutes, even. It could have been minutes since my father put another spray of disinfectant in there, and I still think of that, all these years later. What if he had seen me? What would he say? What would he do? We stalked inside, moving as slowly as we could. We were afraid because it hit us then. It made us realize what truly could have been happening. The place was horrifically dark, and it felt like my flashlight was barely peeking through it. I fumbled for the power switch right under the main console. It was a great, big lever and yanked it down, making the whole place alight. We were supposed to be stealthy, of course, but I didn't even think of it as I turned the switch on. We rarely pulled the full lights on in the tunnel. Usually, we'd do a lesser rig, a couple lights to instill a romantic atmosphere. The place would be lit in purples and pinks, bright Valentine's colors. It hid all the dirty parts, the holes in the wall, the dirty water. The place was drenched in that hideous light as soon as I pulled a lever. I had never seen it like this for so long. The wallpaper was old and faded, ripped apart at the edges, all of it covered in hearts and mold. Cupid looked rotten. The carts began moving through the unclean sludge of the water, filled with sick and stale water, missing its weekly cleaning, turning brownish in the fluorescence. The river smelled like shit and piss. Everything else smelled like bleach. The walls, the floor, the air, everything. We had to cough to get through the stench. She asked me to head back then, to turn the lights off. She didn't want to venture any further, but I didn't let her. We have to find out, I said. But I don't think I really knew then what I could have found out. I don't think I ever had a chance. I got in one of the boats, careful not to get any of the water on me. Lucy followed, more out of duty than any want. The boats began to move, sluggishly through the muck. You could hear it creak, no cute music to hide it. I could hear Lucy start to breathe heavier as the boat moved further and further along the track, the scent growing ever stronger. I don't think my hair was even on end. I wasn't brave. I just didn't understand what was happening. I hadn't figured out what the smell under the bleach, under the shit was. It was some mystery scent, something I couldn't quite place, deep and slightly fruity. I know it now. I know it like the back of my hand. Everything seemed a lot clearer, with fluorescence on full blast. The hearts and the cupids were scattered across the ceiling. I could see now that the cupids were little baby dolls he had attached cardboard wings to. We moved further. The music started up then, which I knew made both of us jump. The smell of bleach got stronger as we moved further and further. I clutched the flashlight. She was talking to me then, telling me we should turn back or something. I wasn't paying attention. All I did was stare forward as the boat moved slowly ever onwards. I wasn't thinking. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Even now it's hard to put it all together. The images flash and swap, and all I know is that we're getting closer. As I write this, I can see us there, trapped in that fucking boat, waiting for it all to end. Because I know where it ends. I know what happens next. I've been having this nightmare for months, years maybe. I always dreamt about this moment, sitting in the boat, knowing what happens next. Sometimes Lucy's there, sometimes not. Sometimes it's my dad sitting in the seat next to me, and no matter how loud I yell, he can never hear me. I always wake up before we get there. It feels like a century before we finally make it to the animatronics. I say that, but they didn't move. They were big dolls, standing still as preset music began to play. They seemed so different in the normal light than they did in the pink one. Their cartoony faces seemed closer to plastic. Their heads are plastic and the bodies are some sort of plush suit. I had never really looked at them closely. My dad had always said that it was too dangerous to step near them, to let the professionals have it. What if I had looked early enough? What if I had seen what he had done? They were plastic and fluff, but they reeked of the bleach and the scent beneath. I wanted to run, really. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible because every bit of me told me that this was wrong. But instead, I stepped off the boat and onto the side of the ride, where the animatronics, the mannequins, stood so still. I wanted to vomit as I edged closer. Lucy was yelling now, telling me to get back in the boat, but I didn't listen. I moved to the mannequin. A pink bear whose eyes were a glittered blue and whose paint had been chipped off, and I pulled off the plastic head. The real one beneath it almost came off with it. The face had rotted like a pumpkin, melting and graying as the innards came pouring out. I could barely tell that it was a human face, but I could make out the barest pieces. The red hair, the glasses. I could make out Thomas, the boy I had seen on the posters and in the park who had vanished into the crowd. And then I vomited. The next few hours are a blur. I have no memory of leaving the tunnel, going through the park, or calling the police. It took them a day to arrest my dad, a month for them to try him. I went home to live with my mom after that, and I never came back to that town. I never came back to that amusement park. I don't think I ever could have. All I can think about when I look up that place or read about it or think of it is what those families could have had. What those families could have had if my father hadn't taken it away from them. Every time I think of it, in the end, I get out of sync. I get back to the beginning of the dream, back when I was 11 years old, when my dad first took me to the park. But I wasn't sad. No, I wasn't. How could I be? With my father owning a theme park, I was so happy. Everything's stained with it now. I can't think of my dad without thinking of what he did. But I was so happy then. He took me across the park and there's this one sentence that stuck with me then. There's no reason to cry. No reason at all. He clapped me on the back, looked over the park, still halfway in construction, and smiled. I realize now he wasn't talking to me. He was looking dead on, right out the window of his office, straight at the tunnel of love. I have some things I need to get off my chest. I think I just went through a near-death experience and I haven't been able to get anyone to believe me. I'm a pilot who takes private clients on aerial tours of the mountains. For reference, I live in Wyoming, right in the middle of the Rockies. Lots of people, mostly tourists, want to be taken up to see the peaks. Great views all around, since we take off right in the middle of the basin. Anyway, as I was looking at the weather reports for the week, I saw that there were going to be extremely strong winds and possibly thunderstorms on a day that I was booked full. I spent the whole morning calling clients to cancel or reschedule their flights for later in the week. There was this one guy who wouldn't leave me alone, though. He kept offering larger sums of money and saying that tomorrow night was the only day he was available. He repeatedly stated that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he definitely won't have another chance to see it because of his age. Eventually, I caved in. He offered to pay double to go tomorrow afternoon. I figured since the weather wasn't projected to be at its worst until a few hours after his appointment, it would be okay to take one flight. I remember that I didn't sleep well that night, with a sinking feeling that something terrible was going to happen. The morning of the flight went as they usually do. I met the client in the lobby of the airport. Tower warned us to be back within the hour. We took off. The air was humid and slightly breezy as we left the runway. My passenger was unmissable enough, and we had small talk between bouts of radio chatter and engine noises. He told me that he was a professor at a small college in Manitoba, visiting his daughter while he was stateside. He explained that he had been concerned about his health for some time now, but he had always loved the mountains and wanted to see them one last time. His love of nature reminded me of my own grandfather. We climbed several thousand feet, and the clouds circling the peaks began to greet us. We were still only halfway up, but the view from here was as incredible as it ever was. When we approached the steep bow of the mountains to the west, the winds began to grow stronger. A gust blew us off course into a dangerous trajectory. Before I could get my bearings, I realized the plane was getting closer and closer to the side of the mountain. I began desperately trying to get the plane to hang on and fought hard against the wind. The old man was shouting and panicking, things I couldn't hear over the cacophony. There was lightning and heavy rain, and everything began to blur together. It was then that I noticed that I was gaining altitude every time the wind blew us off course. At this point, we were well above 10,000 feet in the air. I had never seen anything like this, and I kept trying to get the plane to descend to no avail. This plane wasn't supposed to fly anywhere above 14,000 feet, but it was our only option right now. I was focusing on trying not to stall or flip over. The freezing rain at this altitude made the plane heavier, and it was hard to keep the angle I needed. Sometimes I had to give it to the wind so it would carry us even higher until it momentarily relented. But then, as we approached 15,000 feet, the rain, thunder, all of it just disappeared beneath us. The ice on my wings started to melt, and the sun was beaming brightly ahead of us. It didn't make any sense. Both the passenger and I had gone completely silent. If not for the engine noise, I swore I could have heard birds chirping. I turned to the passenger, about ready to say, "You seeing this shit?" But when I looked, there was no one else in my cockpit. The color drained from my face and I could feel my palms begin to sweat. Despite the utopian scene from my windshield, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing echoing back at me through my headset. Where was he? He couldn't have fallen out. That's absurd. So who was I talking to not even 10 minutes ago? A ghost? I tried to radio tower to no avail. That's when the dizziness hit. I double-checked the altimeter. That can't be right. I was over 21,000 feet in the air. I didn't think my plane could even get that high. I was passing out due to lack of oxygen, and I had to descend fast. I pushed my plane's nose down as far as I could handle, and watched the numbers tick down, desperate to focus on anything. My free hand scrambled for the emergency oxygen. 20,000, 19,000, 18,000. I was getting tunnel vision and barely hanging on. At around 17,500 feet, I began to hear the crackling of my radio. It brought me back into awareness just enough to force the oxygen mask onto my face. I didn't have enough coordination to fiddle with the strap, so I just held it there, my other hand carefully adjusting the Cessna's pitch angle. The shapes of the mountains spun around me as I fought the dizziness and nausea. After what felt like an eternity of descent, I finally hit 10,000 feet and began to sit up straight again. My bones felt like jelly and my limbs felt like they were going to dislocate all at once. But I was alive, with burning questions in my mind. I tried to get Tower to come in on the radio. No response. As I began my much shallower glide down to the surface at around 9,000 feet, I took the time to affix the mask to my face properly. Tower finally came in at around 5,000 feet. The voice was different though. A young woman instead of the man in his 30s that was there when I took off. No one should have done a shift change yet. I hadn't taken off until after lunch. I landed without incident. I expected the runway to be slippery with rain, but it was completely dry. As I made my way out of the garage, I thought for sure someone would ask about the missing passenger, but they mainly seemed bored. It was as if it were any normal day. No one so much as mentioned him. I thought it was weird that they were even there at all, since the weather was supposed to be bad that evening. I asked the receptionist tentatively about the weather. She remarked that it had been a beautiful day, without a cloud in the sky. She also double-checked the paperwork from this afternoon and told me that there was no record of a passenger on my flight. I know there was someone that got into the plane with me that day. There was a storm and that freak wind that carried me twice as high as I should have been able to go. I thought about ordering a search party for him, but there wasn't any record he even existed. My fellow pilots only took pity on me and chalked it up to oxygen deprivation changing my memory of events. But I had my emergency oxygen on almost the entire time. Some of them told me that it was just stress and I should take a few weeks off for my health. Since that day, I haven't gone on any flights. I've also gone to see a therapist. He told me that writing down what happened would help me think about it more clearly and possibly expose what actually happened to me and to the passenger. He didn't tell me to send it to anyone, but I figured posting it here couldn't hurt. I know people have stories like this all the time, people that only they seem to remember. At this point, I don't know what to believe, and I'm afraid that more things have changed than I know about. If you're still reading this, just take my advice, and don't get on a flight when it's supposed to storm. The weather could be the least of your worries. At first, I thought I had kept hitting the trunk button on my keys. You know, the lock, unlock, pop trunk, or start your car buttons that usually come with your set of keys. I always threw my keys on the kitchen table and thought I kept hitting the button upon impact. Seemed plausible in my opinion. I wasn't always the most careful person in the world. It started one day when I started the car to go to work. Trunk ajar appeared on my dashboard. I rolled my eyes just at the sheer thought that I had to get out of the freezing cold again to close my trunk. It didn't even bother to open it. It was only slightly ajar, barely at all, so I just pushed it shut. I thought nothing of it for the rest of the day. This started on a Monday. I had a very strict work schedule and was off every Tuesday and Wednesday. I work long hours, so I try to make the most out of my days. I like to stay at home and mainly just relax. I don't go anywhere usually unless I have to. It's safe to say that my trunk being open was long forgotten by the time Thursday had rolled around. That Thursday morning, I started the car to warm it up while I grabbed the rest of my things. I took my purse off the table, grabbed a fresh bottle of water, and snatched my keys off the kitchen table. When I entered my car, I checked my mirrors, made sure none of the dashboard lights were on, and pushed my foot against the brakes. I drove an automatic, so all I had to do was pull down the shift to drive. It wouldn't budge. Trunk ajar flashed on the part of my dashboard which shows the temperature and the mileage. Annoyed, I stepped out to close my trunk. It was only slightly open, so I pushed it shut once more. It wasn't until I got back into my car that I remember the same thing had happened just days ago. I still chalked it up to my clumsy habit. I admit, it was the first time I thought that something weird might have been going on. It was a fleeting thought at best, though. By the time I had arrived to work, my trunk being open was long forgotten once more. Friday and Saturday morning went exactly the same, and by Saturday night I was officially weirded out. I hadn't given it much thought previously, but like everyone else, sometimes I overthink at night. That Saturday night, I spent hours overthinking what it could possibly be. Even with all the overthinking and uneasy feelings, I still pushed it in the back of my mind. Eventually, I just fell asleep. Sunday morning, as I was getting my things together to leave for work, I couldn't find my keys. I always kept an extra set at the bottom of the top drawer of my nightstand. I began to pull everything out in a panic and I couldn't find them. I was never late for work, and I wasn't about to start now. I gave up on the extra set and decided to keep searching for my normal ones. I found them in my hoodie pocket that I was wearing when I came home the previous day. Irritated by my lack of responsibility once again, I stormed out of my house in a rush. I was in such a hurry, I didn't even realize my trunk was closed for the first time since Monday. Sundays were my short days. I went in an hour later than I usually do and left 2 hours earlier than I normally would. That day went along like any other day. I got home, made sure the car was locked, carefully set the keys on the table, and started to unwind. I turned on the TV and fell asleep on the couch. I woke up around 9 and I was starving. I had slept through the time I usually make dinner. I wasn't about to make a whole meal at 9 p.m. I was tired and just wanted to eat. I decided I would go down to the fast food place down the street and grab a burger. I threw on my jacket, my shoes, and grabbed my keys off the table. Walking down the stairs to get to my front door, I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. I stopped at my front door. I just realized I hadn't gone out at night at all since my trunk started randomly opening. I hadn't even opened my trunk. I just kept pushing it down to shut it every morning. My thoughts started to race. I suppose the darkness made everything seem more grim. I didn't think anything sinister was happening up until that moment. They say you should always listen to your gut. I'm glad I did. I walked out to my car, but this time I checked the trunk first. It was slightly open. I turned on the flash on my phone, stood back, and whipped my trunk open. My trunk looked small from first glance, but went back really far. You had to bend down to see it fully. I pointed my phone at my trunk. It looked empty. I bent down to look inside, but was caught off guard by a slight glare. I looked over and saw a lens. I pointed my phone light at it and realized it was a video camera. Beside it was my extra set of keys. I pulled them out and set them on top of my car. I didn't even check the rest of the trunk. I shut it, locked my car, and went back inside with the camera and my keys. The video camera was dead, but it had an SD card. I pulled it out and put it into my laptop. My screen soon was littered with pictures. They were pictures of me. There were hundreds of photos of me, showering, eating, watching TV, sleeping in bed. Some pictures were innocent, but most of them were inappropriate. Pictures that should have never been taken. Moments that were meant to be private. I became physically ill. Someone had been stalking me, and the dates on the pictures went back months. I called the police and showed them everything. They took the SD card and did a thorough search of my home. When they searched my car, is when it all came together. Someone had cut a hole into the back of my trunk and was living inside of the back seats. They also found he had set up little cameras around my house. He had been stalking me for months, but I never realized until he started setting up cameras. He had taken my spare set of keys when this had started, which is how he got in and out. He was meticulous and precise. I guess they even found a detailed plan. The cameras were his last move. His ultimate goal was to kidnap me one day on my way to work. He planned on cutting his way through the interior and taking me hostage. I don't like to think about what he planned to do after. It makes me sick to this day, and it doesn't take a wild imagination to know what he had planned on doing. Leaving the trunk open was an accident. He started to become sloppy when setting up the cameras. He left the trunk and would hide behind my house until I left. Then, he went inside and started setting up cameras, making sure to leave before I arrived. He ended up leaving the trunk open, probably thinking he closed it quietly. If he would have made sure it was shut, he could have gotten away with everything. They say he fled once I found the camera. He must have been close by because the trunk was open when I went outside. If I would have waited just a few days longer, I wouldn't be here today. I impounded my car and moved across the country. I changed my name and started a new life. Some people who knew me before this happened say I overreacted by going as far as to change my name. I disagree. Someone was smart enough to stalk me every day for months without my knowledge inside of my home. Someone was smart enough to survive inside of my car without raising any sort of suspicion. If someone was smart enough to do that, I have to be smarter. I have to be one step ahead. Until they find him, I will continue to live the lifestyle I have been. I will keep my new name. I will keep this new job. I will continue to overreact. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I would have checked my trunk much earlier. Honestly though, maybe things could have been avoided if I would have just regularly locked my front door.